Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. In this video today, I'm going to give you my recommended VR settings guide, I guess, for high resolution VR headsets, such as the Crystal Light, Varjo Aero, Big Screen Beyond, and even the Quest 3 as well, actually. Even though I have posted a Quest 3 settings video, this kind of ties into it as well. So first of all, I just want to say that I am not an expert with this. I know people think I am, but I really am not. This is just stuff that's working for me, and especially because MSFS 2024 is an absolute pig in VR. Part of that is because we're only running DirectX 12 now, so we are at least 10 frames per second down from 2020. If you haven't seen my comparison video, I'll leave a link in the description below. So first of all, I'm going to look at the settings that I run if you want to use DLSS, and then I'm going to focus on TAA mode. So there's no doubt about it that really to run this sim with a high resolution headset, unfortunately the best way to do it, ideally at the moment, is running DLSS, and it's something that really pains me because I'm not a massive fan, I must admit. But if you do want to use DLSS and give it a try, this is the way that I do it so that I can get a decent level of clarity still, especially with those G1000 cockpits, because at the moment we still cannot get the full resolution of that display due to the ancient HTML code that they're running. And ideally, Asobo need to create a mask for the G1000, G3000 cockpits so that it's sort of free from DLSS so that we can run it at a higher resolution. But at the moment, it just makes all the gauges look really smudgy. But there's a few things that we can do to mitigate that. So the first thing we need to do is download and install the DLSS Swapper. This is probably no news to some of you because I've done a little video on this already, but I have to add it into this video. And we need to update our version of DLSS for MSFS 2024. To do this, go to this tab here and download the latest version. In this case is 3.8.10. Now, of course, as this video gets older, that version is going to change. And if I get time, I will test out these different versions because hopefully they'll get better. But much like Nvidia drivers, sometimes they get worse. And once you've downloaded it, go to this page here, click on 2024 and click on 3.8.10.0. As I say, that version might be different depending upon when you're watching this video, and hit swap. Please be aware this next modification that I'm going to show you is for RTX 4090 owners only. So if you don't have one, please skip this part. So the next thing is a bit more tricky. And by the way, don't be doing these things with your sim activated. I'm only doing this because I'm going to show you my graphic settings in a moment. So let's now go and find where MSFS 2024 has been installed. So for me, this is the location. And of course, this is going to differ depending on where you installed it. But to help you out, I'll put a few default locations in from Steam and MS Store. This is the default location because I didn't change it. I'm quite happy where it's installed on my C drive. And it's C users, that's my account, app data, local packages, Microsoft.limitless, and a load of weird numbers, local cache. And if we scroll down to the bottom, we need to open this, user config. So let's just do that now. And as you can see, there's loads of weird and wonderful settings here. So we need to find secondary scaling VR. If you just scroll down from video, down here to secondary scaling VR, change this to 1.5, okay? No more than that. Right, once you've done that, save it and then get rid of it. And then I'll see you back in the sim. So now we're in the sim, go to your VR settings, that is VR graphics, and then choose auto mode, or you can choose performance, but don't change it to quality because it's going to overpower your resolution. It's going to be too much and the sim will crash, okay? But ideally set it to auto. So in terms of my VR settings, this is what I'm running with a 13th generation 3900K and a AMD base 7950X3D. Notice that I am very conservative with my settings. I would recommend FSR sharpening set to 180. That can be quite high, that's fine. Reprojection mode off for this particular test. Will scale Well, that depends on your headset. For the Crystal and Crystal Light and the Quest 3, I would recommend 105. And Nvidia Reflex Low Latency, that's turbo mode basically, switch that to on or on boost, but I think it goes back to on anyway. And in terms of the dynamic settings, this is a bit of an area of contention for me because I'm not sure whether dynamic settings is causing your ortho imagery to get quite blurry. And just to add, for your FPS target, make sure you set it to either 45 frames per second, perhaps at 90 Hz, or even 30 frames per second at 120 Hz. But really, it's all about where you can hit the most realistic frame target. And to be honest, I'm not even sure if it's really working correctly in VR at the moment anyway. I'm still, a bit unsure about that one. But for now, keep that on. Feel free to test that and let me know in the comments below. In terms of level of detail, well, actually, I'm going to talk about some heavy hitters because in MSFS 2024, interestingly, now that we've got better core utilization, some of the things that used to be heavy hitters for frame rate are not so bad anymore. Well, I would say that terrain level detail is still quite a hit on performance. And to make this worse, right, folks, to make this even worse, I've noticed that for some reason, when you change a setting and then go back to VR, it doesn't always compute correctly. For some of these settings, you need to restart the sim for them to take effect. That's why it's taken me quite a while to do this. But I would recommend no more, unfortunately, than 150, which is here. But actually, feel free to be very conservative and back that off to 90. So anywhere around 150 to 90, I would experiment with. For me, I've settled on 120 for now. That is fine. Now for this one, off-screen terrain pre-caching, that's quite useful if you've got a headset with a decent horizontal field of view, such as the Somnium VR1. But for most of you out there, I really wouldn't recommend any more than high. I have found, and this is across the board here, the settings between high and ultra do make a difference to your FPS, but not so much on the visual fidelity. So I really wouldn't recommend sticking many things at ultra here. So, in fact, I'm not going to go through every single one. If you'd like a video dedicated to explaining all of these settings, then I will do that. Leave a comment on the video below. But for the sake of this video and the length of it, I'm just going to go through some of the major points here that I'm running. So, again, object level of detail. That shouldn't be on 200. No idea why that's on 200. Leave that to 100, okay? Volumetric clouds, that is still a heavy hitter. It is in 2024, and even run this at medium. But unfortunately, what I've noticed is medium to high is a big difference when it comes to visual fidelity, but there is not so much of a difference in performance. But again, when you go to ultra, that's going to kill your frame, so don't bother with that. Keep it at either high, but ideally, if you don't mind losing a bit of that fidelity, keep it to medium. So in terms of texture resolution, in my opinion, both of these, texture resolution and AF filtering, I can't pronounce that, so I'm just going to say AF, leave these on ultra, because with a modern graphics card with plenty of VRAM, and most cards now have a decent level of VRAM, I would recommend keeping this to ultra and high. This, however, is different for a 4070 base card. I would actually take that down to high, and you do need to restart the sim for that. And in terms of your AF, take this down to either 4 or 8 times. But if you do have a really good card, say a 4080 and upwards, then bang this on 16 times in ultra. I am going to show you in a moment what I would run with a 4070, okay? So I'm just basically going through some of these options to give you an idea. When it comes to shadows, this is still something that does hit performance in 2024. So I would recommend keeping them fairly low, 768, terrain shadows at 128, contact shadows at low. I know it's annoying, guys. I know you want to put those settings up, but at the moment, we really cannot run really decent high graphic settings in this sim. You have to be a lot more conservative than you were with 2020. It's just the way things are. Windshield effects, I actually prefer that set to high. I'm sure there was an ultra setting before, maybe not. and also ambient occlusion. Good news, guys, ambient occlusion doesn't hit performance like it used to, and it's a really nice feature, especially for 2024 with all the nice lighting and scattering effects. Keep that on medium, that is absolutely fine. And Q-back reflections, again, this one I would recommend keeping down to very low, because I find personally that reflections in general can really hit your performance. If you've got a 4090 card, then feel free to keep these on medium, no higher than that. Same as light shafts. Although it's worth noting that light shafts do interfere with eye tracking and fixed foveated rendering. So if you see some really weird sort of black bars on either side, take that off. Okay, take it off. Now don't worry guys, in a minute I'm going to overlay my recommended settings for both a 4070 and 4090 in a moment. I'm just going through some of these settings to show you what I've found. Now for glass cockpit refresh rate, for me I always keep this at high, and that's because as a flight simmer, instruments and their refresh rate is incredibly important. In fact, it's more important for me than the scenery outside, especially if I'm doing an instrument landing, or you know, I'm sort of doing a bank turn, looking at my navigation instruments. It has to be as smooth as possible. So that, to me, it depends on how important that is for you, but I really do take this hobby quite seriously, and you know, the instrument gauges need to be at the most smoothest possible. So feel free to change that to your liking. In terms of my character quality, I could not give a toss about it, quite honestly. I know it's a nice little feature, but I don't care about what I look like. It's just added bloatware and graphics that I don't need when I'm flying in VR. So I've kept that to low. Traffic quality, this is something that really is, well, I hate that I've got that on low, because I actually do like to see traffic, but I have noticed that this is a bit of a killer for your CPU. Strangely, I do think it's not very well optimized, so I've kept that to low. Air traffic set to either medium or low. Road traffic can be a bit of a killer, so again, I've got that to medium. For sea traffic, I've set that to high because I love to see all the boats and ships, and I don't think really it makes a massive difference unless you are up close and you're perhaps, you know, flying in the North Sea. But I must admit, I do think that's a great feature. And fauna, that is all your animals. I love to see animals, but quite honestly, feel free to just switch that off because it does kill performance. But at the moment, because it's a new thing, I like to leave it on medium, but it's not so important. Right, now I'm going to give you my settings for a 4090 and a 4070. So here we go. This is for a 4070 running with DLSS. One thing to note here, which I forgot when I was doing the video, is make sure your DLSS is set to quality, but without the modification to your user config file, because as I say, only use that for 4090 GPUs. Now I'm going to show you the settings for a 4090 using DLSS. And again, this time DLSS is set to auto with the config file with the secondary scaling set to 1.5. So that's it, folks. That is what I'm running for DLSS. We're going to look at the Pimax Play software in a moment, but this is something that's really important, and this is why you need to listen to this whole video, okay? Because I'm going to get comments saying, Steve, you crashed my sim, you know. But if you are going to switch to TAA mode, you cannot just switch to TAA mode when you're running this config file. If you want to use TAA, okay, or DLSS sector quality, basically change that back to default. For goodness sake, change it back to default. Otherwise, it's going to be overpowering for your GPU. So let's now talk about TAA mode. The thing is, you cannot run, and I'm sorry to tell you this, folks, but at the moment, with a 4090 even, you cannot run your Pimax Crystal or your Somnium VR1, whatever it is, at full native resolution. You cannot do it. Unfortunately, it's just not possible in MSFS 2024. There's a few things you can do to help with that. The most simplest way is change your render scaling. Now try at 80% first and then scroll it back up. But I personally don't really like doing that. I prefer using, well, two methods. First of all, you can try using the XR Toolkit and override the resolution and take it back. Now for the Crystal and Crystal Light, I would recommend a resolution of 3500, make sure you're writing this down, 3500 by 4142. That, to me, is the sweet spot for a decent level of performance. And even then, you probably will only be able to get between 30 and 35 frames per second, unfortunately. I do find, though, that 30 frames per second in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 feels smoother than 30 frames per second in 2020. I think that is thanks to DirectX 12. So there is a little bit of a silver lining there. Not much of one, but there is one. So you could feasibly tune your system for 30 frames per second. Now, while we're looking at the OpenXR Toolkit, and funny enough, Matt, the founder of the OpenXR Toolkit, doesn't actually recommend that you run this at the moment, but I find it works fine. I would recommend, now if you've got a crystal light, you can use the eye tracking, but to be honest, unfortunately, it doesn't really make a massive difference in terms of the dynamic foveated rendering, because it's not, integrated into the sim. But for fixed foveated rendering, I definitely would recommend using it with the crystal light, because again, it makes a slight difference in performance, probably about 3 frames per second, but of course in VR that does, it's very useful, of course. Now this, of course, also applies for using DLSS as well. These are my OpenXR Toolkit settings that I run with the Crystal, but also with the Varjo Aero, Somnium VR1. I also find that turbo mode can make a difference. So again, experiment with that and let me know in the comments. So just to reiterate, this is what I run with a 4090, with a 13900K and a 7950 X3D processor in TAA mode. Might want to pause the video or write down those settings. And this is what I run with a 4070. Now, bear in mind that some of these things are not going to be so GPU dependent. Things like air traffic and road traffic, that's going to be dependent on your CPU and how many cores that you can bring to the table. So obviously this is not all about GPU performance, and it's a balance of getting everything dialed in. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, these are just baseline settings and you can use them and of course tweak them to your heart's content, because every system is different. Now let's look at the Pimax Play software. So for this, I'm glad to say you don't need the Pimax XR switcher anymore, because Pimax has now got their own Pimax XR runtime. So I'd recommend using Pimax OpenXR as your runtime. Okay, and this is where things get interesting, because unfortunately it doesn't seem like we can really hit 45 frames per second that comfortably. If you can't and you're more liable to hit 30 frames per second, I would recommend using 120 Hz, because it neatly divides itself into the refresh rate better. For example, 3, 6, 9, 12, just simple maths basically. So 120 Hz works better for 30 frames per second. However, if you can run 45 frames per second reliably in 2024 at the moment, well, first of all, please let me know how you're doing that, because there are places you can do, but not in London City. Then I'd recommend 90 Hz, because then feasibly you're only half of the refresh rate in terms of your FPS, which will feel very smooth as well. In terms of 90 Hz upscaled mode, that basically gives you a base resolution of 2160 by 2160, and then Pimax Play upscales it to 2880 by 2880. It does work quite well, only the fact that I personally feel the visual fidelity it just hurts too much. It looks really grainy in the headset. I don't like that, but feel free to try it. You might get better results than me, but the visual drop off in performance is, it's too much for me to handle. Very grainy. I don't recommend it personally. The next thing, if you go to games, well, this is where instead of using the OpenXR Toolkit to override your resolution, to back it off, you can actually do it here if you want to. And if you go to 0.75, try that. If I can get to it, can't quite get there. There we go. Try that as a sort of experiment, and then basically, if you find yourself getting some really good results, then just slowly increase it. I personally feel it's better to do it here than to change the render resolution here. For me personally, I prefer keeping that at high, and as I say, changing and overriding the resolution in the OpenXR toolkit, because I can be a lot more precise with the resolution. That is 3500 by 4142. Now, in terms of locking to half of your refresh rate rather than frame rate, keep this on, because if you can hit 45 frames per second, that is fantastic. Actually, Pimax, it would be nice if we can have another option to lock at quarter of the refresh rate in the future, because then you could lock to 30 frames per second, which would be very nice. Something that Varjo base does, and I'll show you that in a moment. In terms of smart smoothing, I don't think it's working very well, if at all. Pimax, if you're listening to this, please get this sorted out, because we really need it. But for now, switch it off. In terms of fixed foveated rendering, well, it doesn't seem to be working for me in 2024. That's why I'm using it in the OpenXR toolkit. And for quad views, this can actually help performance even when it's fixed. And you can download a separate application for that. I'm not going to mess around with that today in this video, because I haven't really noticed a massive difference in performance, but it's something that you could consider. Let me know again in the comments below if you've messed around with this. But for me, I'm switching this off because it doesn't seem to make any difference at the moment in 2024. There we go. We'll apply and save that. Now, for the Varjo base, for those who are running a Varjo Aero, I do love this software, you know, I really do. This is sort of the same thing that I've just shown you here, is you can sort of lock to 45 or 30. I really do love that option. And of course, with the Varjo base, you've also got pretty decent motion reprojection, or what do they call it? Motion smoothing. Have a play around with that, because you can feasibly lock it at 30 frames per second and then use always enabled, which will then give you 30 frames per second locked motion reprojection, or sorry, motion smoothing in this case. However, I do find at that lower figure, it can be a little bit artifacty. You know, you can see some wobbling of the prop and all that kind of thing. I mean, ideally, we want to have 45 frames per second. But have a play around with that. For me personally, I would prefer to have that at 30 frames per second without motion reprojection, or 45 frames per second with motion reprojection, because you're only getting one fake frame in at that point. By the way, just ignore this because I'm using the XR4. That's why I've got this crazy levels of PPD. For the Varjo Aero, you'll probably get 35 and 39 PPD values here. Now, in terms of HAGs, we call it, just go to your search bar, put GPU in and go to graphic settings. And here you'll find hardware accelerated GPU scheduling. I've turned mine on, but again, that's something for you to play around with. I'm not going to say if it's better or worse, because it depends on your system. But bear in mind that if you switch that off, you're going to need to restart your computer and do your sort of own benchmarking there. But it's again another option for you to try. Now, last but not least is your Nvidia driver. For this, I would recommend 566.14, because apparently it's optimized for MSFS 2024. And if you go to your graphic settings, you might be able to optimize it in here. But personally, all I do here, it's very simple, is change your power management mode to prefer maximum performance. So, you know, that is literally all I do. Now for the Quest 3, I am running these settings, as you can see here on the screen, for a 4090. There we go, just thought I'd show you that. And for a 4070, again, this is what I'm running. And for my virtual desktop settings, this is what I'm running. Pause the video here if you need to. But of course, I've already done a video on this on the Quest 3, but I thought I'd just stick this in here. Now, I would recommend for the Quest 3, because it simply rocks in 2024, that I really am a massive fan of virtual desktop. I know many of you out there want me to try link settings. I will do that. But for me personally, I'm such a big fan of SSW, which is their own motion reprojection implementation. It's so smooth. It's the best I've ever seen. I personally love to use that with the Quest 3 wirelessly, using those settings. And again, the OpenXR Toolkit settings are here, but as you see, they are the same whether I'm running the Quest 3 or Varjo Aero or Crystal or Crystal Light. The only thing I do change is the eye tracking. If I can use it, I will, but to be honest, it doesn't really give you a massive difference in performance. So I hope those settings have been of some use to you. Bear in mind that we're only a couple of weeks in, not even that, with the new sim, and things are going to change fast. So I think I'm going to have to do this again as things drastically change. But please do let me know in the comments below, how are you finding things? Please do let me know if you found something different that I haven't mentioned. As I say, I'm not an expert on this. This is just me sharing what works for me based upon tearing my hair out trying different settings with 3 different PC systems. Thank you so much for watching as always. If you want to support the channel and this content, then please do consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you again in a not so distant future for another video. Take care and bye for now.